Thanks everyone for attending the webinar. My name is Dharmendra Mohan, co-founder and CEO of Sonnet.io. Sonnet.io is a cloud-native VDI solution that provides browser access to SaaS apps, hosted web apps, thick clients, and desktops. No need to deploy anything in end-user devices. Our goal is to make it easy for IT to manage remote access. Our customers are providing remote access within an hour with elastic scalability and seamless end-user experience. Zero trust security and visibility is built into the platform without requiring any additional point solutions. You can visit Sonnet.io for details. I'm excited to have the opportunity to host Shawn and Brian Madden, veterans of end-user computing. I'm looking forward to listening to their views on future of end-user computing, given the technical advancements in cloud computing and the recent VDI market disruptions. Over to you, Shawn. Thank you.
Thanks, DM. Appreciate you kicking us off, and so awesome to be here with all of you talking about end-user computing. I'm delighted to have a longtime friend of mine, an EUC veteran, Brian Madden, joining me on this webinar.
Hi. Hey, Shawn, I can't believe we're doing this after like a 2-year hiatus of doing an EUC webinar. So
it's awesome. There's a lot that's happened in the last 2 years, so we got plenty to cover.
I'll say, those who know Shawn Bass, he sent so we did some emails in a Google Doc about show notes and what we'll discuss, and I'm like, you've got about 7 hours worth of stuff here. Of course, with Shawn's talking speed, we can get it down to 1 hour.
Exactly. Well, there's certainly no reason why we can't do multiple of these over a period of time, talking about the changes that are happening in the EUC space. So look forward to maybe doing an update. So maybe just let's start both with some quick introductions. So I'm Shawn Bass. I've been in the EUC space for 30 years, which now makes me sound incredibly old. Got started out doing consulting, and most recently I was the Chief Technology Officer for VMware End User Computing. And I'm an advisor to Sonnet.io. So happy to have you all here. And Brian, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Brian Madden, and I've been in the tech world for 29.5 years. Not quite as long as Shawn, not quite the old man that he is. But I've been in enterprise consulting. I've written 6 books over the years on Citrix and VDI and DAS and these kinds of things. I actually worked for Shawn at VMware in the CTO office for end user computing, and I've actually spent the past couple of years taking a little step back from enterprise IT and working on other sort of cloud and pinball type technologies. But I'm really happy to be back in the enterprise IT space and joining you today.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian. So what I thought we'd do for maybe about 10, 15 minutes is just kind of recap and talk through some of the major industry events that have occurred in the last couple of years and what the impact has been on the end user computing space. And then we'll shift gears and kind of talk about where do we go from here. So I think maybe to start out with, I kind of want to talk about a really big shift that kind of happened, and it's accelerated obviously over the last few years, but just the sheer dominance of Office 365 as a collaboration platform, in a lot of ways, I think has driven more customers to start considering Azure as a public cloud, the whole idea of keeping their data and their compute kind of co-located. So what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, Microsoft is crushing it. And I'm a guy who very publicly quit the MVP program out of being annoyed with Microsoft and their licensing. In the pinball world for the past 2 years, we've been using Google Workspace as our collaboration tool. It's like the Fisher-Price version of Office. I mean, it's just...
Well, that wasn't always the case. I mean, Google for a long time was much, much better for collaboration than Office was, until they kind of put the gas pedal down on development of Office 365, and it's been a complete market shift since then.
Yeah, and we used to make fun of OneDrive for its ability to delete our files forever, and obviously Microsoft is not without their issues, but they're just nailing it. Everything they're doing with the integration, the management, the Copilot integration, the Office, the platform, it's web, it's online, it's sort of both. It's always delivering PowerPoints is built in a Power. I mean, it's the words can't come out of my mouth. The Microsoft is doing everything right on Office.
Well, let me counterpoint to that. So Microsoft's doing everything right, but let's talk about a major shift in the EUC market. October 2019, Microsoft makes a licensing change with respect to Windows and Office that basically makes it extremely expensive or unsupported to run some of their products in non-Microsoft cloud. So we're talking about things like Office 365 and Windows. What's your thoughts on the impact of that licensing change and kind of what happened as a result of that?
Well, part of Microsoft doing everything right is they do right by their shareholders, and they've been very good at skirting the lines and getting away with as much as they can get away with without getting, sort of like shut down by various regulators. But it's, at the end of the day, we've been saying this for 20 years in end user computing, and back to the early days of Citrix and stuff. It's all about your applications. And the applications are what the users care about. That's what the business cares about. And the sort of like workspace collaboration, your main office suites, and these kinds of things are like the core applications for most companies. And if those are going to be on the Microsoft cloud, and they're going to, make pricing and licensing more attractive for that, and it's just kind of easier just to say, I'm going to start paying Microsoft $35 a user forever. People are doing that, and so it's the impact has been people grumble, but that it's made Azure a big business, and it's really made some of their competitors have to sort of jump through some hoops to try to get the same type of offerings on their platforms that Microsoft can offer natively.
Yep. Now, let's shift gears a little bit, and I want to talk about probably the most disruptive event in end user computing in the last 25 years, which was the global pandemic. And obviously, everyone's talked about the pandemic the last couple of years, but the context in which I want to talk about this is the sheer momentum shift that it made both in the VDI market and desktop as a service market. People have had a running joke for 10, 15 years. Oh, it's the year of VDI, whatever. But 2020, by all accounts, may have been the year of VDI, because every vendor that's in the VDI space and DAS space just had a rocket ship of growth from companies who were very quickly trying to move from 10, 20% remote workers to 100% remote workers in a very short period of time. And keep in mind too, during that time, that those that weren't already successful with VDI couldn't all of a sudden become successful with VDI because they couldn't get servers, they couldn't get endpoint PCs out to the users. So that was also a pretty pivotal moment for the growth of desktop as a service, where customers like, I don't care what it costs, I need 1,000 desktops, let's go. So thoughts on the change there with EUC?
Yeah, and both Shawn, you and I were at VMware at that time, and we both wrote a series of blog posts about that, back in March of 2020. And I went back and read those a couple of weeks ago, and it all sort of still applies, right? We talked about how the pandemic accelerated the adoption of so many technology trends, remote working, all that sort of thing. The same thing was true with VDI. Is everyone got to VDI? A lot of people just emergency went to VDI, kind of however they could, and then as things sort of normalized in the next few years, kind of realized, this VDI is not so bad in these cases, and this is kind of okay here. And they sort of realized that VDI can be a real part of their like integrated solution, what they offer for their users. Now, maybe the way they built the VDI in that emergency way in 2020 wasn't the way they're going to do it moving forward. But they sort of realized, especially as users are moving off of like managed Windows devices and using Macs and iPads and with ARM-based device, all these different devices, we recognize that VDI really has a place. Like, I think a lot of people thought VDI was a short transition into whatever's next. I think whatever's next is there's some applications that for whatever reasons make sense to deploy via VDI. I think we're still going to be talking about VDI in 10 years. Yeah,
that's a good point. Now, I will say conversely that I did talk to a number of customers who had grown quite a bit in DAS in the emergency mode of the pandemic. And as the pandemic started getting into a normal kind of event, and companies started embracing return to office, there were a lot of customers that said, hey, this desktop as a service thing can be quite expensive. We're going to kind of pare it down, use it where it makes sense. And this has kind of happened, I think, cyclically with VDI and terminal services as well, where customers have built it out because they needed to, but over time, some of their applications got modernized, got replaced by web or SaaS applications. In a lot of cases, customers have shrunk down their investments in some ways, or I guess I should say right size or purpose fit the use cases, where it makes sense. So it kind of depends on, the composition of the applications that are in use by the companies.
And I want to say, like, that applies to all technologies, not just enterprise and not just EUC. And a sidebar, when we say VDI, DAS, I mean, Gabe Knuth and I wrote a book about DAS. And if you didn't read that book, the gist is DAS is just VDI you pay someone else to host. So when we say VDI, I'm including like self-hosted, cloud-hosted, DAS, all the different forms of that. But like all technologies, as the technologies mature, they become more modular and more easy to integrate. And so people are going to use some form of remoting delivery for some form of applications in some way for a long time. But to your point, people realize, hey, it was really easy to get a provider to light up all my desktops and turn them on. And then, it's kind of like we're sort of realizing, like, when we all decided that we don't need to own our music anymore, we'll just use, Spotify forever. I'm like, dang, like $15 a month every single month I'm listening to the same 5 CDs I listened to in the 1990s. Maybe I don't need to have the service. So it's just the right balance.
Yeah, makes sense. Now, while we were talking about some of the Microsoft licensing changes and kind of some of the gravity that created for Azure, pretty recently there was a response from Microsoft related to the European Union, kind of investigation into practices that I think in a lot of ways has caused Microsoft to rethink some of their software licensing policies. I won't say they've completely fixed what had happened in October 2019, but they've certainly opened up or become more flexible with some of their licensing. So Brad Smith had posted a blog back in, I think it was May 2022, basically acknowledging the European cloud provider market and that Microsoft was making some licensing changes. Then we saw in August of this year that Microsoft loosened the licensing restrictions for, Office 365 within Amazon Workspaces, but didn't sort of blanketly say like all providers, all types are going to be covered by this. And they did also make some changes in October 2023 for license mobility. They got rid of the VDA licensing requirement. They made it a little bit more flexible in terms of where your licenses can be moved. So, I want to get your thoughts on this. Obviously, it hasn't completely fixed all of the October 2019 licensing restrictions, but it feels like it's getting a little bit step in the right direction. So thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, gosh, yay for regulation and government oversight. I mean, this is what, I get it. There's that dichotomy and that struggle between like tech who wants to go fast and break things and regulations who are kind of old and slow and stodgy. But at the end of the day, Europe tends to be a little bit ahead of America in terms of their competition regulations. And we're seeing this not just within the EUC space, but look at what, Apple's got USB-C ports and Apple's talking about adding, RCS to iMessage and these kinds of things. So, like these companies are only going to move when they have to, because at the end of the day, like all these massive companies we're talking about have one responsibility, and that's to their shareholders. And so, we are starting to see that when they get squeezed or there's hints that there might be squeezing from the government, then they can start to do what a lot of consumers would think is like the right thing. So I, in this case, am like actually a fan of continuing to put pressure. And it does seem like kind of BS that, if you've got one company that owns your cloud and your platform and your delivery and your office suites, and that, they can really squeeze you and force you to do things. And I think we are going to continue to see, especially AI is opening. This is not an AI conversation, but AI is like waking a lot of people up to like the importance of regulation. And I think that's going to drag along a lot of stuff that ends up being better for all of us as buyers and consumers of these technologies.
Yeah, that's a great point. So I want to touch on one other topic related to sort of product life cycle and what might be the end of a certain technology. And this is one that I think is near and dear to a lot of the old school EUC people that have been around for a long time, because in the early days of EUC, everything was built off of the principle of terminal services, or RDSH. And there was a period of time over the last couple of years that Microsoft was sort of signaling that RDSH was going to go away. They had kind of signaled it was going to be end of life sometime in 2025, and they kind of extended it to 2026. A lot of people thought that because Microsoft created the multi-session client OS, Windows 10, Windows 11 multi-session, that was going to be what would ultimately replace terminal services. And literally very, very recently at Microsoft Ignite, we just got confirmation that Microsoft is intending to support RDSH within Windows Server v.next and every subsequent release of Windows Server during mainstream support. So I think this is a huge relief to those organizations that run RDSH on premises today, or want to run RDSH, in a hosted colo provider or cloud provider without worrying about having to switch to Windows client multi-session, because as you know, or most people on this webinar hopefully know, multi-session is an Azure only hosted feature. You can't run it on-prem or in a non-Azure cloud. So I want to gather your thoughts on RDSH and what the future means there.
I mean, we've been talking about this also for 10 years and talked about how, Windows client multi-session was really focused, like that's where the UI lives, and like that's where all the innovation is around the consumer user experience and the server. I think Microsoft long-term is trying to get the UI off the server and separate things. I mean, the reality is, like, what is a server? What is a computer? What is a client? That's all changing now. Even when you look in these data centers, like, these are not racks of Dell servers, right? These are like stripped down circuit boards, like power supplies at the end of the aisle. Like, it's not, they don't have USB ports on them. Where is your virtualization stack? Is it at the data center, the hypervisor, the OS, what runs where? So this is, as we sort of figure out, like, at the end of the day, these cloud providers are just massive scale, and they're trying to squeeze out like tenths of pennies on operating these things. And so they're going to continue to evolve that in a way that allows them to deliver the experience that's needed as cheaply as possible. I think what's they're realizing is that, like, when you're delivering a remote, like, Windows experience, you don't need the whole Windows desktop. Like, users have a client device that provides most of like the Chrome and the frosting that they need. And so, like, Windows servers just shooting out, Office sessions or whatever it is that the specific app is they're using, I think is a very cheap and efficient and proven way to do it. Servers are managed like servers. I think that's the point that is come up in the chat box. Server management and data center management is different than client OS management. And so let's manage our servers like servers. And I think that's where RDSH is and why it still exists. And I think it's going to probably exist for a long time also.
Yeah, well, and certainly if we were to compare RDSH and VDI, if we leave multi-session aside for a moment, there's the age-old battle of which one's more scalable, which one's more cost-effective. And there's arguments to be made on either side, but I think the generally accepted practice is that RDSH can provide a cheaper or more scalable way of delivering your applications to your users, especially if they don't need 25 Windows apps, but they need like 2 or 3 to do their job. Doing that on individual client-hosted OS instances is certainly not a cost-effective and scalable way, just in terms of the infrastructure required. And while we're talking about infrastructure required, that's an area too that when you think about desktop as a service, your compute and storage and networking requirements are a really big deal. That if you're running that desktop 6 to 8 hours a day, it's great. If you're having it run 24 hours a day, consuming a bunch of resources in the public cloud, the bills for desktop as a service can become, quite substantial if companies are not good about managing the power cycle or life cycle management of those desktops. So yet again, a win for terminal services, where you can kind of flex the growth of the environment on demand and not give every single user their own virtual desktop in the cloud.
Yeah, we as humans are not good at thinking about scalability, right? So like, oh, this desktop's only 45 cents an hour. I mean, that adds up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Last kind of recent history event I want to talk through with you is sort of the dynamics of the vendors in the EUC space. Now, a couple of years back, we saw Citrix being taken private by Vista Equity Partners and Evergreen in a deal that took them off the public market and kind of trying to transform them as a company. And obviously some customers are concerned about these moves, because sometimes private equity operates in a way that kind of focuses the company on a core set of customers and optimizes the organization to kill off certain product lines or changes the investment envelopes in different technologies. And so we saw that happen with Citrix. Some customers concerned, looking for alternatives because of this. And then, relatively recently in the news was the Broadcom acquisition announcement for VMware, which has been out there since May of last year, which finally closed in November of this year. That in and of itself, again, some customers may be concerned about what the future of VMware looks like under Broadcom. And very recently, literally last week, we heard news that Broadcom was planning to potentially sell off the end user computing business unit, and the security business unit or carbon black business unit. So I want to gather your thoughts on what all of these go private operations might do to these technology companies.
Well,
and I know you don't have a crystal ball. I just want to kind of get your thoughts.
It's part of the life cycle, you know. It's part of the life cycle of a company, and like look at all these great companies. Shawn, we were joking when we first, before the webcast started, about like how we both started in the 90s and like the big names, you know, Tivoli and CA and Symantec and Citrix, and you know, where do all these companies end up? They end up at private equity. You know, Broadcom is called Broadcom, but they're a private equity company also. Obviously, they've announced they're going to spin off, you know, VMware, or they're going to do something with VMware, a spin-off or a sale or something like that.
If you're EUC, you mean?
Yeah, sorry, correct. VMware EUC, they're going to do something with. I think that, you know, Shawn, when you and I were at VMware, we're always talking about like this integrated, like it's, you know, it's Horizon, it's VDI, it's integrated with unified endpoint management, it's integrated with, you know, like your workspace access and like all the kind of trust network and SSL VPN, all integrated into one sort of big suite, and can do all these like really awesome things if you buy into the platform. And Citrix, we're talking about that too. I think that that's kind of happening, but it's sort of more happening by Microsoft. And Microsoft doesn't quite have the same vision as what a Citrix or VMware would have. But Microsoft, because they're more of a baseline platform providers and they have their own cloud and all that sort of stuff. But I think that it's like, to me, this whole like integrated vision where like all this stuff is integrated together and going to be a platform bundle, I think it's just not happening. Like, I think Horizon is going to be Horizon. You know, Workspace ONE, UEM is going to be UEM. You know,
in some ways, the point that you're making is it's really hard to do that complete platform integration if you don't own, let's say, a public cloud where these things are going to run, or you don't own the full stack of the operating environment.
Or you don't own the Windows license. You don't own the ability to do whatever you want. I mean, Microsoft, you know, famously can like kill a company with a PowerPoint. Like, we're going to develop this feature. So you know, it's just, I think it's going to change it. I think both Citrix and VMware EUC are going to become just kind of more tactical for customers. I mean, as you know, like people, this is one of the things, like the little, almost a chip we had on our shoulder sometimes at VMware. Like VMware Horizon was like a good product. Like a lot of people used it, massive environments that had a lot going for it. And, you know, like we didn't nail everything always, but nor Citrix and Microsoft. And I think that's, like, there's a lot of people that use Horizon and that use Workspace ONE UEM who love it and it works for them. And I think they'll keep on using it and loving it, and it will be working for them. But it's like going to be a tactical tool that they're plugging into their overall IT environment. It's not like my whole EUC platform is just going to be VMware or just going to be Citrix. I think if that was going to happen, it was going to have, you know, that ship has sailed.
Yeah, makes sense. All right, let's shift gears a little bit. You know, this session is titled "The Future of End User Computing," and I want to spend probably the next 20 minutes or so going over really what does the future of end user computing look like. And we're going to touch on a bunch of different topics, but let's just start out in one area that's kind of adjacent. I mean, we've been talking a lot about VDI and DAS and terminal services, but I want to shift attention a little bit to talk about mobility. And the reason I want to talk about mobility is, there is a big trend and shift for people. Like, everything has got to be mobile. We got to have mobile apps. We've got to have, all this stuff, working on a smartphone and that kind of stuff over the last couple of years. Now, the reality is that no companies, shifted their whole IT operations into mobile apps. Like, there's still tons of desktops and desktop apps that people are using, but there's a big craze to push everything to mobility a couple of years ago. And I want to touch on something in particular, this whole talk about like mobile application management and sandboxing of the apps on the mobile device versus device management. And really wanted to say, like, the idea of having like your corporate email and your personal phone kind of sandbox, like, that's kind of fallen out of popularity. Obviously, back in the days of, BlackBerry and good technology, it was a pretty common thing. But I think in a lot of ways, going back to what we talked about earlier with the popularity of Office 365, it became the dominant email platform. And when Microsoft acquired Acompli and then built their own Outlook iOS app and Outlook Android app, that kind of killed off the whole mobile application management BYOD strategy, because not only did every customer want the Outlook native app, but they couldn't really apply MAM security controls to Outlook in the same way that Microsoft could do it natively in their own platform. So that whole MAM market kind of disappeared. And even when we talk about BYOD in the context of like desktop PCs, people still embrace BYOD for like VDI because there's a separation of the data versus the endpoint, and users, you don't want them saving data down to their endpoint device. But BYOD on mobile or BYOD for personal laptops really kind of fell out of favor. And this even happened at VMware, where they started saying, if you want to use a personal device, you've got to manage it with our tool set. And so thoughts on the BYOD market and kind of what's happened there, and does it have a future per se?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack with what you said. I would sort of say, like, to your point, now that the Microsoft Office products are native on iOS and Android, and those do have their like MAM-like functionality built into them, and that takes care of 95% of the audience right there. If you need more specific security requirements, then you can sort of get into delivering applications via VDI or other third parties. A lot of times, though, people are starting to use the whole device-based security, like enrolled devices. So that's like when you have that, which is not really BYO, right? So that's like your Uber driver, have the assigned phone to them, or like your insurance investigators, or terminals for point of sale devices and that kind of stuff. And so it's I think that is a separate category. It's kind of sort of disappeared. And we're also really seeing that people are using lots of different devices and are able to use the different applications on the different devices, and everything is sort of synchronized on the back end. So again, using Office as an example, I've got web version of Word, I've got native Mac version of Word, I've got Word installed on my iOS device. And those are all 3 different applications, but like it's kind of using the same files and the same storage in the back end and the same collaboration and authentication and that kind of stuff. It's the same if you use Zoom. If you use, gosh, what are my other applications on here? Like all the applications that people use, like there are web versions and mobile versions, and you don't have to try to manage like one app across the devices. You sort of manage the app like in the back end and what people can do in it. And all those capabilities are built into the client apps themselves. And then when you get into laptops, the same kind of thing. It sort of depends on what style of worker you are, but there's enough tools built into like Office 365, or if you're using the Adobe apps or whatever app suite you're using, they kind of have their own sort of security built in. And so different companies will do different, take different steps, but it's not like really a selling point anymore. It's almost taken for granted. Like this is a really big deal 10 years ago, and now it's just, I don't know, kind of everything we need is sort of built into the applications we need. And, we don't really think about it too much anymore.
Well, I think what you're touching on, a lot of this has to do with the changing workforce dynamic. I remember when, I started in the EUC space 30 years ago, the average worker that just worked on a single device, didn't have a mobile phone, obviously, because they weren't around, didn't have tablets, none of that kind of stuff. And the only OS they ever used was Windows to do their job. That we would obsess over the stupidest things, like we can't have an icon move on a portal screen from position 1 to position 3 because the users would freak out. And you think about like the millennial and Gen Z workforce that's making up a huge contingent of the workforce today, like they're used to switching between devices constantly, and like they don't care if an update applies and the form factor changes and the app was here and now it's here. Like the whole workforce dynamics changed dramatically. So we don't necessarily have to think about doing things the same way we've done them in the past, and the workers are much more flexible about how they use their applications. So totally agree with you there. While we're talking about applications, because we always talk about in the EUC land, like it's about the apps, right? It's all about the apps. In the EUC space, Windows has dominated in terms of the enterprise IT footprint. The Windows is 90% of the enterprise NT endpoints that are out there. But if you look at the application developer community and what's happened there in the course of the last 10, 20 years, no one's really developing net new Windows client server apps. There's certainly people maintaining and trying to modernize older Windows client server apps, but there's really no new Windows client server apps being built. Everyone is developing web and SaaS style applications. So the one thing I wanted to talk about with you about this is, what does this mean for the future of what types of devices people are using and what type of applications they're using? So just if you could spend a moment talking about that.
Yeah, I mean, like web and SaaS apps, fundamentally they're all very modular, right? So it's kind of say web and SaaS are the same thing, it's just based on the purchasing model. But at the end of the day, architecturally, they're all client server apps. They're just written this modern way, and it's actually really easy to make native iOS and Android native apps. If the app has a market for that, and there's a need where it makes sense, like middle school kids can write iOS apps nowadays, and all these like frameworks and connections, and it's just really, I don't want to say easy to do, but like it's just a lot less complicated than it was in the old days. And so, where you would have developed your client server app in the past, you still develop like your client server app today. It's just your client there's a web version for desktops. Maybe, there's an iOS version and Android version, similar. I mean, even like on Mac users, the iOS version now can also run on your desktop and have larger screen sizes and that sort of thing. So I think it's going again, it is about the applications, whatever security needs the applications require can be built into the application clients themselves that the vendors can build. And I think this is why we are seeing, every enterprise app that's out there, even if it's a new hot kind of web SaaS app, also has an App Store version for the Mac, for Windows, Microsoft Store version, Android version, and that's where people have gone.
Right. Now, obviously, there are still 30 million Windows apps out in existence, and that's going to take a long time for all of those to get rewritten and replaced. I mean, it may be with us for another decade or two, but I want to be a little bit provocative here and talk about the futures of the technology. My take on this, and I want to see if you agree or disagree, is that VDI as a technology, because it is a Windows desktop in its entirety and all the applications and data that kind of coexist or co-reside within that desktop, I think over time that construct goes away as people are using MacBooks and Chromebooks and other devices to do their work within their web and SaaS applications. But given that we do have a number of client server Windows apps that people are still going to depend on, I foresee a pretty long future for terminal services, which is something, of course, RDSH has been around for 30 years. People have been using it a lot, but in some ways, RDSH kind of dipped a little bit as people started going into VDI, but the question is, does that reverse over time and RDSH becomes more prominent because VDI starts decreasing? What are your thoughts there?
I could definitely see that. I mean, we have these like old Windows apps are written on old technology stacks, and like we talked about, like Intel processors are falling out of favor on mobile devices, at least for now. Like VBA is kind of like ending at some point, and a lot of stuff kind of moving forward. Like the Windows applications that people depend on are just kind of their requirements stay the same, and the world kind of moves on. And there's going to be ways to emulate and virtualize and containerize and all that sort of thing. Those types of applications, but in another 10 years, if you need a Windows app, like it's not because you want to use Windows. You don't even probably want to use that app. Like it's like, I don't know, like isn't Sabre on when you check into your airline still like a terminal application on a mainframe somewhere, So like I think there are going to be these apps that are around forever, but like they are around because like they have to be, and it's just going to be like what is the simplest, just easiest way to get this app out to the users where they need it, where we don't have to mess with them and mess with the endpoints and all that sort of thing. So to me, that does go back to like an RDSH type. Like I'm just delivering, they call it the published application, like we used to call it in the old days. Like I don't think people are going to, remoting Windows to get the Windows client desktop experience. And especially we're going to put things on our faces now, and it's on the screen. It's just no one wants to remote a whole UI, whole consumer experience. Like it's just going to be, if there's an app that has to be remoted, I'm going to remote just that app, and that's going back to like RDS is kind of great for that.
That kind of reminds me, like every vendor in the EUC space at some point in time has built a demo, a proof of concept of their VDI solution running on AR, VR goggles.
Yeah.
And like every time you see that, you're like, why? Why would somebody do this?
Yeah, I'm not AR VR guy. I can tell you that for sure. And so who knows? But I know it will be a thing.
Yeah. Now we talked about the prevalence of web apps and SaaS apps being kind of like the dominant form factor for the future. Now technologies like VDI and desktop as a service currently can obviously deliver a web-based application. They don't necessarily need to do it because what you're running is in the public cloud and a browser is a browser. And some people would view it as a way to say like, well, if I get my users to use my Salesforce app through the VDI or DAS, then I could try to control or prevent them from downloading data, and I can, protect the data that's downloaded and that kind of stuff, which is true to a degree. But, the challenge with serving up a browser in a virtual desktop is, there's nothing that stops the user from downloading data to the virtual desktop and then uploading it to their cloud storage or uploading it to their email or any number of things. So when people are doing web apps in the VDI or DAS, a lot of times you've got to augment that with a bunch of other layered technologies like a DLP agent or a cloud web security proxy solution to try to control that data, because obviously, data protection or data loss prevention is really an important thing. You've talked about this a lot over the last 10, 15 years, this consumerization of IT, like people applying the way that they do things in their consumer life to the enterprise life. So what do you think about this in the context of web apps and security of data?
I mean, it is just a continuation of that same conversation where, any data, anything that is content created by an end user, you have no chance of protecting because they can always just pick up their iPhone and just do it over there. So what we're really talking about is sort of like institutional data. We really only care about data that we're regulated on, which I hate to say it, but that's it, right? Like no one cared about patient privacy until HIPAA was a thing, financial data until Sarbanes-Oxley was a thing. And so at the end of the day, like the data coming out of the systems on the back end is going to be a lot more easy to protect. Even like screenshots and that kind of thing, you can never really protect because again, you can pick up a camera and point it at the screen and like there's ways around all this kind of stuff. But it's, what we're trying to protect is like someone like dumping your database out, dumping the core data out in the back end. And that tends to live in a more protected enclave, even though it might be in some public cloud. That's easier to protect. So I think that we focus on the areas that we can realistically try to protect, which is, like the data itself in the back end. And, if data is going down into a client device and, you got someone looking over the shoulder and recording their little snippets they're going to see, like, there's not much you can do about that. So it's not worth worrying about as much.
Got it. All right, we've got a ton of questions, so I want to shift to one last topic. And it would not be a webinar talking about the future of end user computing if we didn't spend a good chunk of time on the impact of AI. So I'll call this the AI all the things. Historically, AI has been around for many, many decades. It's not been that hot of a topic in the grand scheme of things up until OpenAI released ChatGPT about a year ago. And then the floodgates opened on, I would say, both, people recognizing all the different ways it could help them be productive. And then, of course, all of the doom and gloom that, humanity is going to cease to exist because AI is going to take over. So I guess let's start with your thoughts on how AI is impacting worker productivity, good, bad, and different.
Yeah. And if we just narrow down this conversation, the good news for us, and I wrote about this on LinkedIn a couple months ago, that everyone watching this webinar right now is, in the end user computing space. We've seen this game before. Like it happened with the consumerization of IT and users bringing in their own applications and their own devices. This is users bringing in BYO AI. And just like with these devices, if companies say, no, you cannot do this, like what's to stop you from just having ChatGPT on my phone and just doing it over here and you can't even know about it? There are a lot of this technology is blown up, as we know, like fastest growth of an application kind of in history and everything. And the technology is pretty amazing. And I think that, we're learning that like these large language models that are these public foundational models are not as great with their knowledge, but they are really good at, hey, I gotta like tell this person to stop talking to me, but not in a way that's going to get me fired. Help me craft the email to them. And so like that, we're seeing a lot of people using that. And I do a lot of coding in my like pinball related work, and like GitHub Copilot, I can write 50% faster now. Like absolutely, that's real. We talk about even hallucinations and stuff. there are hallucinations in these language models when you look at like the data from the internet and the world at large. But when you train it on your own data, like give a PDF and say, give me these things, or like what Microsoft is doing, and it just crawls your own internal, like knowledge repositories. The hallucination is the effect is not nearly as great as you have like with all the data sort of in the world. So there's all of that. Like this is happening, it's coming, and like whether we like it or not, so to figure out like how to make our policies around that. To me, though, the real interesting conversation is like, remember, this is end user computing, right? It's all about the applications. But even you can peel that off again. Well, it's not really about the applications. The applications are tools, which are the means to the end, which is for us to do our jobs. Do I need applications to do my job? If I have a fantastic language model, and gosh, I chat with ChatGPT, like using the earbud, walking around in the voice interface, and it's mind-boggling. Imagine that with my own stuff where, I'm not like telling it to write emails and then sending you emails, then you're reading and parsing emails. It's like, why are we sending emails? Like, I need this from Shawn. I need this. Where's the data? Like so much stuff that we do in our applications, we don't need if we have chat AI interfaces to it. Like, I don't need to make a PowerPoint or a document to send to you for you to read. Like it's almost like we're chatting, interacting with our data itself. And so that, to me, if you want to really look in the future, I mean, these GPTs and Office Copilot, this is great for now, but it's going to be a way different world in 5 years where we are all sort of like interactively conversing with our data. And that's what's going to change the form factor of applications. It's not about, is it on an iPhone or a VR goggles? It's like we're talking to our data and talking to like our work. And how does that look?
Well, I think you nailed a very important point there. Is the AI can process this massive amounts of data set and summarize it for the human to really speed up the rate in which they could otherwise do their normal job. So productivity is obviously off the cliff there in terms of how much better you are at processing vast amounts of data. You touched on another thing too about companies and their kind of uneasiness about the use of these tools. And it's kind of funny because you talk about the consumerization of IT. In a lot of ways, that's kind of what's happening with AI right now. Like we saw some knee-jerk reactions to companies very publicly in the news the last couple of months saying like, oh, wow, we found company confidential code fragments out in various different AI engines. And for a moment of time, you started seeing companies craft policies that said like, you can't use ChatGPT, for company code samples or copying company confidential data, whatever the case may be. And in a lot of ways, this almost feels like the early days of like Dropbox and Gmail, like companies saying like, oh, we're going to shut down these domains so you can't exchange data with them. But at the rate of AI companies coming like every hour, it seems, I just don't see that being an effective strategy for companies to try to block access to AI. What they've got to be thinking more about is policy. How do we educate our users on what acceptable and non-acceptable uses of AI? And then secondly, you talked about this earlier about 10, 15 minutes ago, like how do we really focus on securing our data in order to educate users that, hey, copying company confidential code out into ChatGPT poses risk to our organization. You shouldn't be doing that, and kind of coach the users into what acceptable and unacceptable uses.
Yeah, and like, we as the companies need to provide alternatives that are acceptable. So it was to your point exactly. Like, I can't tell you not to use Dropbox, and you have to use our file share, which requires a VPN and a Windows laptop and all these kinds of things. So this is one of the things where I think Microsoft is doing a really good job with their integrations with Open AI and moving moving Copilot into everything. And where it's going to say like, okay, I mean, users can build their own GPTs that are extremely powerful now. You build it based on talking to it and like telling it what you want and how the application wants to work. As long as my company provides, I think of like working at VMware with like 40,000 employees. If I'm like, hey, when this email comes in this spreadsheet, do this, I want you to do that. And I'm typing what I want it to do. It's almost like a product requirement doc, and the AI just does it. As long as companies provide a way for employees to actually use the technology, then I think the companies are going to be safe. If they don't, the users are still going to use it. And this is even easier. Like I said, you just talk to it. Like my mom uses ChatGPT.
Yeah.
You just talk to it. I mean, it's really, really easy to do. So companies are really going to be under the gun to provide alternatives to their workforce. Otherwise, people are just going to do it on their own because it's so easy to do.
So one last quick item, then we'll shift over to some question and answer. You touched on the term Copilot from Microsoft. Obviously, Microsoft has a huge investment in OpenAI and has announced integrations of OpenAI into just every single Microsoft tool on the planet. So I don't know if you've seen the diagram, but there's a Copilot diagram from Microsoft that shows it integrating into everything: the OS, browser and search, Office, all these things.
Everything.
So question in that regard, obviously any vendor in the EUC space can integrate generative AI into their products. The question is, do other EUC vendors, do they have an ability to do it at the same level of what Microsoft is doing between, GitHub and their Office and all these things? What are your thoughts there?
I mean, AI can be integrated in a product in so many different ways. Also think about from us as administrators on the back end, AI enhanced, security monitoring, configuration management. I mean, the days of, give a new user for Bob, give a new laptop for Bob, set it up. I mean, it's figuring out what you need. I think you look at these exchanges like Zapier and these kinds of things that hook into all these other environments. These are available to sort of all customers and all vendors. Like AI is really good at reading API specs and then writing and integrating into other things. So like as a vendor, it's kind of like, you just have to have an API spec. It doesn't even have to be easy to use because the AI doesn't care. And your customers, whether it's your IT buyers, IT customers, or whether they're end users, will be able to integrate everything that they need in the way that they need. So I think that it's just kind of like the same thing we've been asking vendors to do for like forever ago. Like, just give us an API and, we can do great things with it. And I think AI is just going to accelerate the integrations that can be done. Like, you don't have to be Microsoft. I think this is a case of AI actually like lowering the walled garden a little bit, where, it can make things accessible to anyone, where before you had to have, like, look at everything again, go back to VMware, what we try to do at VMware UC with integration of like Workspace ONE, UEM, and Horizon, and all this stuff. And it's like engineers and engineers and engineers and years and years and years of work. And now this is, a 12-minute conversation with an AI and it's done.
Yep. All right, let's flip over to a couple of questions we got here. There was a really good question here that I think talks about a very important trend that's happened in the last decade or so, which is this movement to public cloud. Lots of companies have been replatforming their applications and modernizing them and putting up in public cloud, and that has started organizations to start thinking about, like, should all aspects of our data center end user compute, meaning VDI and terminal services, should that also move up to public cloud? In a lot of ways, you were sort of like shamed if you were kind of running on premises because everyone else is moving to the cloud and you have to move to the cloud. Now, we have seen examples of some customers who have moved to the cloud, and in some cases have moved things back on premises for cost reasons or security reasons or any number of things. So thought process on, moving to cloud, moving some things back, what is the right sweet spot there?
And again, AI will accelerate this as well, but it's like we talked about at VMware quite a bit, where what is the cloud exactly? It's just a building on-prem, it's just a building, but it might be not even a building that I own. What is a server? Where is it? Everything is becoming more fungible in general and more easy to sort of move around and grow and expand and everything. So I think these boundaries are going to continue to become more blurry. I think the idea that you can have sort of AI overseer looking over the stuff and like, oh, this workload's running here, I can live migrate it over there now. Oh, now it's over here. Now I'm going down on-prem. This one has a data piece. I want to be more secure, so it's going over here. And everything's just kind of running sort of wherever it needs to. And we can automate that to the extent that we feel comfortable. I don't think it's going to really matter, like cloud versus not cloud versus on-prem versus server versus container versus physical versus virtual. Those lines are just disappearing. Like they're just breaking down, and they're going to continue to break down.
One of the things that you and I have talked about before is the role of AI in helping modernize some of our applications. So you bring up the great example of, VBA is kind of going away. Like, what if you could kind of give AI a job to look at some kind of complex spreadsheet that you've got with a bunch of embedded code and say, hey, rewrite this for me in a modern way?
Yeah, and look, if you haven't, I mean, I feel like still most people's impressions of AI are either Skynet, from Terminator, or like the movie Her, or it's they've used ChatGPT to like get some recipes, and they're like, oh, this is just fancy autocompletes. You're wrong. If that's what you're thinking, this stuff is insane. It's so wild. It's moving so fast, and the idea of like, here's all my VBA apps, write these into something modern. You figure out what it should be. I mean, it's not even saying like, okay, AI might make mistakes. It might, you might want some humans to look at to do code analysis, that kind of thing. But like, it can do, if migrating an app from a VBA Excel spreadsheet to whatever the modern version of that is, might have taken, an expert 8 months. It might be something that the AI can sort of do in, 20 minutes. And then you have someone spend a day or two to sort of polish it up. And that's not gonna happen. That's happening now and has been happening. Like, this stuff is happening. So everything you're describing for like these old legacy applications, interfaces, where they run, I mean, you like this API version 1 is not rewrite, I guess version 1, version 6 is common, is the present day one. Update this to version 6. And it gets up and down. The context windows are getting larger. I mean, it's here today. Like, it really is. And it's impacting us more than we know. And it's going to change things more than we know.
Excellent. Another question that came in is, what are your thoughts about the use of, enterprise browsers or secure browser technology, whether it's a remote browser isolation or an enterprise browser that runs on the device? And I'll throw a couple of my thoughts in here first, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too. Because we've talked about this movement to more and more web and SaaS applications, obviously we want to provide people with ability to run those web and SaaS apps. But we also are very concerned about the security controls, particularly around the data and what people can do with the data. Can they download it? Can they edit it? Can they store it different places? And enterprise browsers and browser isolation certainly can provide us an additional set of security controls. But it doesn't solve the problem per se of the Windows client server apps that we need through a VDI or a RDSH. And in some ways, it also has challenges with that topic we talked about of companies wanting to move away from BYOD on an endpoint device when they're concerned about data leakage risks or whatever the case may be, that the data is actually sitting on the end user device. So I'd like to get your thoughts on kind of remote browser isolation or enterprise browser as a tool and where it fits.
I like this. I mean, as we talk about, there are still like almost every desktop app nowadays really means that's a browser-based app. And these enterprise like remote browser isolation and that sort of stuff. Hard eye rolled at that like 15 years ago when it started to become a thing. But now, the world's moved on. We have more bandwidth, we have more capabilities, we have better technology for delivering things. There's a lot to love about this. And if an organization has a handful of apps that are delivered via browsers, certainly they all have different requirements for what they need in plugins and access, all that kind of stuff. I mean, I think we've figured out how to do like multimedia integration and all these kinds of things, regardless of what your client device is like. I love the idea of just remoting it down. I mean, people remote down all their Netflix content, they remote down their music. It's just like that. Like, hey, here's our 5 important apps. You go to a website, the users don't even know they're getting pixels sent to them as a concept. So I don't like doing it on the endpoint as much, because you start to like increase the requirements for endpoints, and like it just feels like more work to manage. But if it's just like, go to a website, here's the URL, use whatever you want, I don't even care, and it just works, I mean, how can you not love that?
Yeah. All right. Another question here in terms of user experience management and monitoring. There's a whole new category that's emerged for DEX, and it's all about visibility and observability, both around performance, around security, and all those types of things. What are your thoughts on the DEX market and what impact it has on user compute?
You and I have fantasized about like how IT really could understand what their users are feeling and what they're experiencing for years. Because well, you could analyze this and look at the firewall, look at the network, and look at the connection, look at the pixels, and analyze all that stuff. And you could build this complex Rube Goldberg style machine that could sort of capture all that and deliver like a user experience score. And here's another one where AI is going to be able to do that better. So I feel like the AI's ability to just analyze, one, all the signals that we know about, look at your logs, look at your bandwidth, look at your pixels, look at all those kinds of things. But also they can detect, like, is the user angry typing? I mean, I know they
Yeah.
can't detect how hard they push the key, but they can detect is the sentiment and how they're doing. Like, I think that will be there where there's like a little AI sort of user experience monitor that's like, hey, Brian's about to like drop a bunch of curse words in a big meeting in front of important people. You should know about this before it happens.
That's a standard. You could just autofill that and assume.
A hypothetical example, of course. But I mean, so I think AI is going to really turbocharge this like user experience or like DEX market. And I think there's a lot of value there because, again, these companies are, at the end of the day, they care about how they keep their employees engaged and happy. And to the extent that someone can be like happy with their job and their work and all that kind of stuff. And we were just really trying. We were like biting around the edges to try to do that in the past. And I think these technologies will really allow that to happen. And these technologies will also allow people to be happier because it can let them work in more ways. And we can say now, work in your own way. And I've got some AI security bot on the back end that's going to just look over your shoulder and make sure everything you're doing is cool. So I think that's a really hot market that's has a lot of potential, and we're going to see a lot of evolution in the next couple of years.
Another question that came in is touching on the role of thin client devices over the years in end user computing and what the future looks like there. Obviously, Amazon just made an announcement about a new thin client device adapted from the Fire Cubes. Thoughts on the thin client market and where that's headed and how it fits in?
That thin client cube from the Fire Cubes, thin client, I think it's actually really cool. I still read Slashdot, if that like shows my age, and all the people on there were like, it doesn't even have these ports, or it doesn't have this, or my PC has. I'm like, you still don't get it. You don't get it. Like, companies, they just want it to work, and like, know it works, know it's secure. Like, that's the reason why there are $1,000 thin clients when there are also $200 PCs. I love the idea. I mean, gosh, we use it like. There's Chromebox, Chrome Stick, Apple TV. We have all these things all over our devices. If it has a screen, it should, like, I shouldn't have to bring a device to plug into a screen to use it. It should just have like something that makes it work and do what I need. And if that's a $200 thin client that's stuck on the back of it, and I turn it on, it connects right to Amazon's cloud in that case, or it connects, if it's a Microsoft one that just it connects immediately. Like, you turn it on, you type in your email address, and it knows what to do with you, and then you've got whatever it is that you need on this thing. I like that a lot. So I think companies.
So low cost, instant on, purpose built, and you don't have to maintain it or put a bunch of work into operating and patching and managing the device. Those are all tick marks that are in the positive side.
Yeah, and it'll do it just like we're all used to that with our devices and our phones and that kind of thing. It'll kind of do it on its own. And the model made sense for 20 years ago. It still makes sense today. Companies don't want to manage devices.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Well, I think we've come to the end of our time. I want to thank everyone for joining the webinar here and for joining Brian and I today to talk about some of the things that have happened in the industry over the last couple of years, and then also a look forward and see where things are going. So I want to thank Brian for his time today joining me on this. Had a lot of fun talking about the EUC space. I'd like to wish all of you a happy holiday, and I'll be putting a blog out in a couple of days that touches on some of the things we talked about here on the Somnet.io blog. And thank you all for participating. DM, any closing thoughts?
No, thank you so much, Brian and Shawn. It was definitely good to hear all the views, both from the past and where we are going. So yeah, thank you so much, and we'll hopefully have follow-up webinars on individual topics as well that we discussed. So yeah, that'll be great. Thank you so much.
Thanks all. Happy holidays.
Thanks.